Hello, and welcome back to Philosophy 1050, an introduction to philosophy. This is Lecture 7. In today's lecture, we'll be introducing Aristotle, who lived in Athens between the years 384 and 322 BC. He is one of the most famous Greek philosophers, rivaled only by Plato himself. As always, we'll begin with a little bit of an overview of Aristotle himself and his ideas, and then we'll dive down into his physics, which is the main reading for this lecture. So Aristotle was a student of Plato's, and he went on to teach Alexander the Great, who, I don't know how up on your history you are, but he conquered what was the known world at the time. Aristotle created his own school of philosophy, known as the Lyceum, and I'll give you a bit of a closer look at that. You can find it online should you want to look closer. And he wrote over 400 books that contributed to basically every single area of philosophy. So in the end, Aristotle faced a similar charge to what Socrates faced. However, when he had the chance to escape Athens, he chose to do so, saying that he wouldn't want the same sort of crime against philosophy to be able to happen twice. So, like Plato and Socrates, Aristotle is what was known as a teleologist. Teleologist. So this comes from the word telos, which is Greek for something roughly akin to purpose. It's the same sort of purposeness that we saw in Plato's thinking. However, that purposefulness will factor as a key idea in Aristotle's thinking. This means that he understood the world to be organized according to a universal goal of some sort, the good. He thought this because of the patterns he observed in nature. So the thing about Aristotle, and this leads us to one of the main departures that Aristotle had from Plato, was that Aristotle was more down to earth than Plato, and you could say that Plato was, with his head more in the clouds. So you can actually see here, in the blue is Aristotle, and in the orange-ish is Plato. And you can see Plato is actually pointing to the sky, and Aristotle has his hand lowered to the earth. So even in this famous painting by Raphael, actually I'm not sure if it's a painting or a fresco. In any case, that sort of difference between them really sticks out. So if there's one thing that you really should keep in mind when thinking about Aristotle as compared to Plato, it's that Aristotle is more about observing things in this world, whereas Plato is more about contemplating the forms in the intelligible realm, which we covered in our previous lectures. So Aristotle did not think that forms existed separately as perfect things in some sort of other realm, intelligible or otherwise. Instead, Aristotle believed that forms were something that existed as part of objects, literally part of them. You cannot have a form without having an object in Aristotle's point of view. And basically because you need an object to take the form. A reason for his thinking this is that Plato's forms would have been eternal and unchanging, but the real world around us is always changing, as is noted by many of the thinkers we've covered so far. So they wouldn't be able to help explain it. Whatever the forms are, they're not changing. But this world, it's always changing. So whatever is doing the work can't be the forms, because they're not... there's no different states that they can be in, and therefore they're never initiating anything, I think is a good way to think about that. So, in all, Aristotle wanted to replace myths and symbols with rational explanation and logical precision. He was the first to introduce formal rules to logic, and was one of the biggest promoters of physics as a study of the observable world, which, again, leads us back to our reading for this week. In his answer, What is the World?, Aristotle gives a few concepts. So, I'm going to take this down now. I think it's served its purpose. So, some of the concepts that we get from Aristotle, firstly, is this thing called substrata. Now, substrata is basically like matter. So it's stuff. It's the stuff that the world is made out of. So for now, let's just call it matter. So in some sense, he was bringing in that Helicist tradition. Hylacists, forgive me. Another main concept was privation. Or in some senses, potential. Potential. And this, in some sense, was kind of like the absence of form, or in the potential sense, it's the unfulfilledness. It's hard to explain, but basically it's kind of in some ways the opposite of form. So let's just call this the absence of form. Yeah, if you can't tell, this isn't the most expensive whiteboard in the world. And then after that, we have another one that is form, or in other words, actuality. So in this is basically instead of the privation or potential, it's the presence of form and the actuality. So it's basically the presence of form. And lastly, we have the concept of substance. So in many people think of the word substance and either think of it as just like another word for stuff, and often like a sticky stuff, or there's a substance on there. Back then, or at least historically speaking, the word substance in philosophy has had a very specific understanding, and it's something like substrata plus form equals substance. So substance is something that, in other words, has properties. It's something that you can say something about. It's not just shapeless matter, in other words. So to Aristotle, the world was basically stuff that moves around because the potential in stuff solidifies into different actual forms, which cause different properties in the substrata. The different properties, furthermore, cause different changes and thus even more forms. So you can imagine that you have the substrata, which is, let's say, the matter or whatever, and then within that substrata, the particles themselves have some basic amount of form, which allows them to, come together into a rock. Let's say these are a bunch of particles coming together into a rock, and being a rock, it now has certain properties as a rock, like solidity, stability, and then later on, an artist can come chip away at that rock and make some sort of sculpture. Let's do one of those bad dogs, one of those bad dog drawings. And the point is that throughout that process, there's things that are being retained in terms of the form and properties, but there's also form being added onto that. So the form of the sculpture was something that wasn't there before in some sense, and it was then added on. So a key part of understanding Aristotle's metaphysics is basically grasping his famous account of causality, which again has four main elements to it. So think there should be enough room. So the first sort of cause, and again, keep in mind that this is Aristotle trying to give an account of physics, or the natural stuff in the world. The material cause is basically, as I said before, the stuff that goes into making this the sculpture. So we have the material cause, and for the sake of keeping this easy, I'm gonna use the example of the sculpture throughout. So in the case of the sculpture, the material cause would be the rock or marble, however you want to categorize it. And so basically what the material cause is then is the stuff that is undergoing the change. Undergoing the change. Now, the second main cause is the formal cause. Formal. And the formal cause, as the name would imply, has to do with the form that the thing is sort of adhering to, but not necessarily. How should I put this? It's kind of like the blueprint, the actual information in the blueprint. So in this case, the formal cause would be the design of the sculpture. So if it's a sculpture of a horse, then the specific way that horse is meant to be designed is what the formal cause is. Now, be careful, because I just used the word meant, and that's actually part of a different cause that we'll get to a little bit later. Now, I should say and give a few more examples for the material cause. So, for example, the material cause of a sword would be the iron it's shaped out of. The material cause of a chair would be the wood it's crafted out of. For the formal cause, this, again, would be the design of the chair or the make of the sword, the actual mold that it's going to be poured in some sense, contains that formal information required to create the sword. And so that brings us to the third one, which is the efficient cause. Efficient cause. Now, the efficient cause, if we're to stick with the sculpture example, would be the sculptor who is chipping away at the rock. So specifically it would be, or more generally rather, it would be the initiator, the agent behind the change. Now, for the sword, it would be the blacksmith who is the efficient cause. For the chair, it would be the carpenter who is the efficient cause. And so the efficient cause is basically the initiating thing that we typically associate with causality. So when we say, who made that statue or what made that statue, we typically say it was the agent or the sculptor. So, in other words, the efficient cause. You can, in principle, apply this to more blunt things, such as, what caused that tsunami to hit, and you can say that it was the earthquake. So there is analysis there, and Aristotle actually goes into this sort of analysis of sort of accidental and non-accidental a bit later. But for now, let's just get clear on his four causes. So the fourth cause, then, is known as the final cause. Now, the final cause has to do with that word teleologist. that we learned earlier, which is basically someone who studies the purposes of things. So the final cause is basically the purpose or the reason why the change was made. So the final cause in the case of the sculpture would be the artist's intention to bring about the form of the sculpture. So it's common to mix up the final cause and the formal cause, because in some sense the point of the change is to bring about the form, and the form is the thing that it's changing towards. And so sometimes people mix those things up or combine them, but there is an important difference here, which is the final cause is where purpose comes into it. The formal cause is just a bunch of information describing the form that it's about to take. So the final cause then is the purpose of the change. And Aristotle's idea basically was that physics, because again, keep in mind that back then physics and science generally wasn't what it is today. Physics had to look very carefully at the causes in nature, and there's different kinds of causes that you can say are responsible for why a thing comes about or happens. So again, in some sense, the cause of a sculpture is the stuff it's made of. In another sense, the cause of the sculpture is the blueprint that it's tending towards. In another sense of the cause, it's the person who caused the change that created the sculpture. Or, again, in another sense of the cause was the intention of that person, that the idea they had in mind, or in other words, their pondering of that original formal cause. So Aristotle does have purpose in his system. As mentioned, he is a teleologist, but he wants to distinguish between conscious purpose and unconscious purpose. Now, nature is not conscious, but it does act in a way that is stable enough so that we can deduce some purposes that naturally arose within nature. Like, for example, the purpose of the eye is to see. Nature, being unconscious, follows its purposes generally as a rule. However, it's not absolute. So sometimes it can break away from those natural tendencies. Sometimes, for example, people are born with eyes that don't work. So despite the purpose of the eye being to see, sometimes that purpose isn't fulfilled. So even though it is law-like, it isn't an absolute law, is what Aristotle is trying to say. Humans, conversely, are conscious, so they can impart purpose on things through their intentions. We can, for example, decide that the purpose of a knife is to cut bread. Now, as far as Aristotle's views on ethics and politics go, his ethical position is what is now known as virtue ethics. It is one of the main branches of ethics even to this day. The basic idea here, which we'll cover in detail in the next lecture, is that you should pursue happiness, and the way you do that is by being as virtuous as possible, as excellent as possible. The problem, though, is, and this is where politics comes in, the only way you can be as virtuous as possible, as excellent as possible, is if you have a certain kind of society around you, a good society that is able to support you in becoming that virtuous person. Now, the virtues in question consists of intellectual virtues, which can be taught, but also of moral virtues, which are the kind of virtues that you can only pick up through habit, by trying and trying and trying, and eventually just become second nature. These virtues typically take the form of some sort of middle position between two extremes. So, for example, if we have on one end of the spectrum cowardliness, so running away even at the slightest sight of danger, and on the other side we have something like foolhardiness, which is running face forward into a rhino den or something like that, because you're not afraid of rhinos. Well, you're probably going to die. So these are two extremes of, like, let's say, risk tolerance, and the virtue between them is what we call courage, and it's some sort of middle ground. So that's basically what Aristotle wants to say a lot of virtues work like. There's these extremes, and within those extremes is the virtue. But as I said, we'll cover more of that in detail in the next lecture. So, without further ado, let's get back to, or let's start rather, Aristotle's physics. So, with all that said, Aristotle begins the chapter we read by stating the difference between what is natural and what is artificial. And he says that nature is that which changes and is by accident. So let's get rid of this stuff here. So we can write down some definitions. So nature is by accident. And it changes. Now, as far as the purpose of nature, nature gets its purpose from within. So to recap then, nature is something that happens by accident, and he'll go into more detail what the nature of accident or chance is later. And nature changes. And as far as the purpose that nature has, because again, keep in mind, he's a teleologist. He wants to say that there's these things called final causes that exist not just within the human world, but also in the natural world. And the purpose is gotten from within. So it's not as though there's something outside of nature that is giving nature its purpose. It's rather nature giving purpose to itself, perhaps by growing or developing or evolving. Now the artificial is intentional. It is not supposed to change. Aristotle says it doesn't change, but basically it's not supposed to, but time destroys all things. Not supposed to change. And the artificial gets its purpose from outside. So what does that mean, purpose from outside? So remember the knife example? We decide that a knife is for cutting bread, or a particular knife rather is for cutting bread. That is us, outside of the knife, assigning to the knife, which is an artificial object, a purpose. Now, if in nature, however, it would be something more like the frog assigns purpose to itself through its tendency to, this gets a little bit deeper and beyond the purposes of this class, but there's kind of a cycle between the form and the purpose, and as things evolve and grow, they kind of assign their own purpose by capitalizing on what works. So the frog, its purpose is in some sense to catch flies within the ecosystem, and it does that because of what it is, because it's a frog. So there's this sort of like internal purposiveness that doesn't happen when we're talking about knives made by people. Now he goes on to say that some account for nature by looking at the underlying thing, whereas others account for nature by looking at a thing's overall shape or form. So remember again when I was talking about the block of stone that got turned into, I don't know, let's just call it a tombstone. So some people, Aristotle is saying, explain nature by looking at what the stuff is made out of. Let's also have a flower here. Right? So some people look at what the flower is made out of, so that's kind of almost like a physics or chemist's analysis of what a flower or a rock is, and others look at the overall form. So a person that's looking at the form of this rock would be able to tell that, it's actually RIP tombstone, and they'd be able to give some further account of it. On the flowers case, a biologist would be able to analyze, or says that we should analyze nature in terms of the flower's overall form instead of its individual particles that make it up. Now, Aristotle basically wants to say that a good student of nature has to account for both of these things, not just the stuff it's made out of, but also the overall form that it takes. Specifically, the student of nature must be able to account for what he calls that for the sake of which. So it's kind of like this clumsy way of saying the purpose of something, but it's becomes more helpful to phrase it that way the more you get into it. But I'm detouring again. So Aristotle makes the point that this isn't necessarily the last state. So the why of a thing, everything has a why. It's the state that something is existing in order to achieve. And Aristotle wants to say that's not necessarily the last state of a thing. So here we can look at this flower, right? So we would have the stages of the flower, and then, the flower is kind of wilting and dying. So Aristotle is saying that the purpose of the thing isn't necessarily the last stage or the last thing to happen. Sometimes the purpose of the flower is or of anything really, is when that thing is the best or most fulfilling its purpose. The flower is most fulfilling its purpose when it's flourishing. And that word has a lot of baggage that goes into it, but again, I'm sidetracking. So, all in all, Aristotle in this section is explaining the four causes that I explained earlier. The material, the formal, the efficient, and the final. A good student of nature, says Aristotle, must account for all of these in order to give an account of what exists in the world. Not only this, but they must also give a few other subdivisions of causes. So besides those four causes that we covered earlier, there's another few ways that you can divide up ways of talking about causes. So first there's the particular versus the general. Next, there's the intentional versus the accidental. And lastly, there's the complex versus the singular. So let's start with the first one then, the particular versus the general. So what he's talking about here is basically you can give a cause that is very specific to what happened. So you can say something like, why did Bill kick Tim? And the particular, very particular answer that we would give today would be something like, well, the nerves in his leg activated, which activated the muscles, which caused a chemical reaction that forced them to expand, and that pushed his foot forward, and it hit Tim's leg, and that's what happened. Well, that's a very particular sort of cause. A more general cause is something that looks at the overall. So you could say something like, well, Bill kicked Tim because Tim and Bill have a history of feuding. Other examples you could give are something like, why did that person die? Well, you could say, well, the bullet hit them, or you could give a more general cause and say something like, well, the war started last year. So that's kind of the particular and general. It's kind of like how zoomed out you are when you're giving the answer to what caused this. Now the next one, the intentional versus accidental, it comes back to the whether or not someone intended for that particular effect to happen. So if the cause was so if the effect was intended, then it's intentional. If it wasn't, then it's accidental. And this comes back when we're talking about sort of chance and the difference between nature and artificial structures. The last one is complex versus singular. Now, this one is similar to particular versus general, but it's not the same thing. Now, complex versus singular, as the words might imply, a complex cause is one that has many different things going on. So when you're talking about the cause of a war, you'd have to give something like a bunch of different accounts of a bunch of different forces acting at different times, and the cause of the war starting is all these things coming together. Whereas a singular cause is something that you can just stop at. Why did the billiard ball go into the hole? Well, the other billiard ball struck it at this particular angle. And that's all you have to say as far as what caused it. Now, after outlining all these different ways we can look at causes, Aristotle zooms in on another thing that we might consider: chance. So some accept that chance is a cause while others don't. So Aristotle is just kind of trying to tease out whether or not we can consider chance a cause. Others still both accept chance and don't accept it by suggesting that there is order in the world out there, like the way an oak forms from an acorn, but that the world itself arose by chance. Aristotle finds this odd, however, because there is more order in the heavens than there is even in the behavior of animals. Animals seem much more unpredictable than the movement of the stars. So in any case, Aristotle lays out a few more categories here. So something that almost always comes to pass in the same way. So something that always happens the same way. That, according to Aristotle, is not chance. Quite straightforwardly, if it happens in the same way, then you can predict it, and if you can predict it, then quite straightforwardly, it's not chance. Everything else is chance. So I think that suffices, actually. So, in other words, chance is something that almost never comes to pass in the same way, or never happens in the same way. This seems pretty straightforward so far. He's saying that things that act according to patterns aren't chance, whereas things that act according to no patterns are chance. But Aristotle wants to be even more specific here. One of the things that act according to no patterns, so according to the things that, let's see here, no patterns. So within this category of no things that happen according to no patterns, we have the things that happen intentionally and the things that happen unintentionally. So chance only properly applies, says Aristotle, to the things that happen without anybody intending them. If someone intends something to happen that doesn't necessarily have any pattern, then in some sense it's not chance. To illustrate this, Aristotle uses the example of a pale carpenter. So the fact that the carpenter happens to be pale is by chance, but nevertheless it is part of the carpenter and thus part of what caused, let's say, the house to be. A second example he uses is of the person taking subscriptions. So, at that time, if someone was about to have a big dinner party, they would take subscriptions, which basically means people not just RSVPing, but agreeing to sort of contribute a little bit, or maybe chip a little bit of money ahead of time. So he gives the example of the subscription taker who is heading to the market. Now, if the subscription taker heads to the market with the intention of getting some subscriptions and he gets them, well, then we don't call that chance. However, if the subscription taker is just heading to the market because he has to pick up a few things and he has no intention whatsoever of, going out of his way or even thinking about getting subscriptions that day because let's say he planned to do it tomorrow, then if he happens to bump into someone at the market and they give him a subscription, then we say that that happened by chance. Thus, chance implies that there is no choosing involved, but it could have been involved. Thus, chance implies matters of thought. The thing is, though, that chance only seems like a cause, but does not in itself cause anything, according to Aristotle. The paleness of the carpenter isn't what causes the house to be built, but rather the carpenter's skills themselves. When things occur without a pattern, without the possibility of choice, Aristotle points out that we instead call this spontaneity. When something happens without the possibility of choice and without pattern, then we call that spontaneity. Now, a horse, for example, says Aristotle, runs up to someone, and let's say they're in trouble, and that horse saves that person by having run up to them and the person is able to jump on the horse and get away. He says that happens by spontaneity, not by chance, because the horse, at least back then, was considered to be this sort of unthinking part of nature, as is an animal. Of course, the particular understandings of chance and spontaneity are not necessarily as obvious today, especially considering that Aristotle was Greek and he was speaking in Greek. So all of these words have certain Greek counterparts that don't necessarily have all of the same connotations we have today. Now, for now, let's just allow him that chance is what we call unpredictable matters which could have happened due to a reason, and spontaneity is unpredictable matters that could not have happened intentionally, such as a volcano or the movements of animals. In any case, Aristotle makes the point that chance and spontaneity are causal explanations given instead of a proper account. An account holds always and for the most part. Almost always comes to pass the same way, and so can be relied upon in the future. Chance does not always hold always and for the most part, and so it's not really an account of anything, certainly not a scientific account in the way we would think of it today. So, having done away with chance as a potential cause, so he doesn't have to put it amongst the four causes we talked about earlier, Aristotle answers the question, why do we think that nature is for the sake of anything? Why do we think that there's purpose in nature? Could nature exist the way it does just because of necessity? Because it has no other choice? Here, quite interestingly, Aristotle suggests that though necessity, through necessity, I had a typo in my notes. Through necessity, the things that are organized better survive, and the things that are organized not so well perish. And so this could be an account of how necessity creates things in nature without the need for purpose. Aristotle says this is all well and good. The way these things come to become well organized is either due to coincidence or it's because of something. It cannot be due to coincidence because nature is way too reliably predictable, so it must be for some sort of reason. Now, Aristotle kind of brushes off something that is very shockingly similar to the evolutionary account that Darwin much later would give. But let's just move on from that because that'll take us a bit too far in field, but I do want to note that. So, in other words, action for an end is present in things which come to be and are by nature. Nature has teleology. So basically, let's actually put this on the board here. So to recap that argument then, Aristotle is saying that things can either seem to be well adapted, either by coincidence or due to some sort of purpose or adaptation. Aristotle wants to say that it can't be coincidence because nature is regular, and if it was just due to coincidence, then there wouldn't be regularity. And so because it can't be coincidence, then therefore it must be due to purpose. He even gives some examples, like the bees who seemingly create their hive with the purpose of protecting their young and storing their food. In general, form is what nature is doing things for the sake of. Nature is tending towards form. A seed, for example, is a form which carries the potential to become the form of an oak. Its purpose is to be an oak. An oak, conversely, has very little potential left, but it can produce seeds for the purpose of making more oaks. And so no matter which part of nature you're looking at, there's a sort of ideal thing or purpose that nature seems to be tending towards. And I think it bears mentioning again that sort of difference then. So if we're graphing it, we can kind of think of it like this. So your potential starts, I'm going to make this double. So your potential line is this one, potential, and your actuality line is here. So when a seed is a seed, its potential is very high because it can become an oak that can take very many different shapes. But its actuality is very low. It's just a seed. And as the seed grows, its actuality realizes, so its form starts becoming shaped and locking into form. And as that shape comes about, the potential goes down, because as things lock in, there's less potential for other things to come about. And so that brings us back to that sort of duality between potential and actuality, form and the absence of form. There's this sort of interplay, according to Aristotle, and within that is this sort of encoded, purposeful direction towards realizing form within nature. So even though this process of maintaining and creating form sometimes goes wrong or gets stopped prematurely, that doesn't mean that this isn't what's happening, says Aristotle. Nature is tending towards form, and that just is what its teleology is. So Aristotle then moves on to talk about necessity, and he wants to say that something is necessary only relative to a goal. So something is necessary if there's no other way to achieve your set goal without it. Air, for example, is necessary if part of your goals are to breathe. On its own, though, there's nothing necessary about air. Thus, necessity is something that exists in matter, in the substrata. It is properties that you cannot change, but can harness towards your goals, as opposed to necessity. Purpose lies in the definition of those goals. So basically the tools for realizing your goals are within the matter in the world, whereas the purpose lies within the definition of those goals, and being very specific about it. So moving on, we now come to book 3, which is on motion. So before we begin, it is crucial to point out that what Aristotle means by motion isn't motion necessarily in the sense of something moving, but rather motion in the sense of change. So motion seems to imply Yeah, so like for example, going from cold to hot would be an example of motion in Aristotle's view. So the first thing that he wants to say about motion is that it is continuous. So let's clear some space here. So Aristotle wants to say about motion that it is continuous. Now, what does continuous mean? I mean, you might be able to get it just from the word itself, but basically, continuous means that there's an infinite amount of steps between both of the extremes, but there's no actual division between them. So, remember Zeno's paradox of chopping up the line into an infinite amount of bits. The problem there was basically that you're chopping it up, whereas if something is continuous, such as motion, then you can't properly chop it up. So basically it just means that in some sense it's like a spectrum rather than a set of solid steps. Now, the opposite of this is discrete. And in discrete, it's more like, a bunch of Lego brick sort of things where the same thing is analyzed not as one continuous thing, but as a series of separate things. Aristotle doesn't focus too much on discreteness, though, so we can take that down for now and focus on continuousness. So, anything that is infinitely divisible, like a line, is continuous, according to Aristotle. And the next thing that Aristotle wants to say about motion is that it's always relative to some stated property. There's no such thing as absolute motion over and above everything else. Motion in the world, for example, is always relative to Earth. Like, for example, in this video right now, motion is roughly relative to the background here. Motion in temperature is usually measured relative to some particular temperature that it's moving towards or away from. Like in Celsius, technically in Fahrenheit and Celsius, the reference temperature is 0, and everything is measured relative to that particular temperature, and it's totally arbitrary. You could in principle move 0 so that it's actually higher and 10 degrees instead of 0 degrees, and everything would still work out because it's all relative to that thing. Now, Aristotle also wants to say that there are many types of motion, and in fact there are as many types of motion as there are being, because as we said, or rather as I said, his understanding of motion isn't just the motion of objects, but generally speaking the motion between one state to another state. So, for example, white, black, complete, incomplete, up, down, light, heavy, potential, actual, here, there. Motion is difficult to define, ultimately, says Aristotle, because motion is neither something that it is, nor something that it is not. It exists somewhere in between these two things. It goes back to Zeno's sort of paradox, where motion is this weird thing that doesn't make sense if you analyze it in terms of being here and then being there. Not only that, but every mover is also themselves moved, according to Aristotle. The rings of the later law of Isaac, rings of the later laws of Isaac Newton. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So again, we're finding all kinds of sort of references to from our modern science in these very old thinkers. In Aristotle's understanding, the mover is themselves moving from a state of potentially moving an object to a state of actually moving that object, which, again, is itself a motion. So you have potentially moving to actually moving. So you have the mover who's doing that, and let's call it the moved. The moved is going from a potential of potentially being moved to actually being moved. So you can see that in this every action has an equal and opposite reaction sort of idea that Aristotle has going on. In the most basic thing, now we call it mover and move, we can also call it the cause and the effect. But in any case, I think this is a good sort of general statement of what he's trying to say here. It's that no matter what happens, if you're going to act on an object and move it from being just potentially moved to actually being moved, then you're moving yourself from potentially moving something to actually moving something. So, because of that, we're able to get a pretty specific definition out of Aristotle, which up to now has been relatively rare, getting a good solid definition. So what is motion then, according to Aristotle? Well, motion is the fulfillment of the movable by being moved by something which has the power to cause motion. By being moved by something which has the power to cause motion. So, if you recall from the pre-Socratics and even Plato, the act of trying to define something was usually treated either as something that experts would make themselves fools out of, or something that, at least in Socrates' case, would just be shied away from. Oh, I can't give you a definition. Well, in Aristotle's case, he's not quite so shy because he's sort of trying to base his ideas in the world. So, because the definition is this way, the mover and the thing moved become, in some sense, one thing, one single event. He compares this to teaching. So a teacher cannot be a teacher without a student to teach, and a student cannot be taught without a teacher there teaching them. In order for them to go from potential teachers and students to actual students and teachers, then they need to come together in some sort of moment of teaching. Not quite sure how that would apply to video lectures like this in the year 2021, but I digress. So to conclude, we have covered Aristotle's physics, or at least a very small portion of it. The main thing that Aristotle revolutionized was the synthesis of forms and the study of things here in the tangible world. His focus on the observable led him to be one of the most important philosophers of science. For centuries to come, people in Europe and the Eastern world would look to Aristotle for insights on how the world worked. He was actually kind of like an authority on physics. Beyond his insights into physics and science, Aristotle also had some very specific ideas about ethics and politics. And we will cover those in the next lecture. See you there.